But what do you say about people who, maybe from within Islam even, look at you and say, well, you're not doing it right. You've got it wrong. They've got it right.
Yes, there is this great battle, and it's very much heightened by Islamism, of the purity and authenticity. In fact, that's what consumes the Islamist, as opposed to somebody who would see themselves as a pluralistic Muslim or heterodox Muslim. But I think there was a very pivotal event. Certainly my parents are very devoted, are very observant, and they've given me all of the literacy in my faith so that I can also be devoted and observant. But while I was practicing in Saudi Arabia, I happened to witness September 11th. And that was a pivotal event which really changed my entire vantage. It wasn't just the event whereby suddenly the world was confronting a radical Islamist, Al-Qaeda, and I'm thinking, where did they come from my fellow co-religionists? But it was also the reaction to 9/11, which was much more shocking. And I wrote about that in my book, In the Land of Invisible Women, where the next day after witnessing 9/11 on the television, I was working amongst my fellow physicians in an intensive care unit. And I found that I was the only one that was devastated, even though many of those Muslim physicians had actually trained in New York, including in New York City, with some of the same professors that I had. And some of the immediate conspiracies within hours of 9/11 was that it was an event inflicted on the United States by Jews, or that the Jewish people had fled the World Trade Center, and that also this tremendous schadenfreude and tremendous satisfaction at this calamity, which was costing many lives in New York. Ironically, almost a decade later, I would become a physician treating people who've survived 9/11, and I still do that every day. I have a practice of 9/11 surviving patients for almost 15 years now.
That's amazing. Is that something you've done sort of consciously because you feel that you saw it up front so directly at the time, and really you wanted to make sure that you carried that on through your professional life?
So actually it was by chance. Unfortunately, because so many people were impacted by 9/11 in New York, and my practice is in New York, we happen to be a designated World Trade Center monitoring center. So therefore, that is part of my patient population, but it gives me a very deep understanding of the impact of Islamist terrorism on individuals, on societies, and on generations. And I think that has had an influence on me.
When you think about Islamist terrorism and Islamist ideology generally, do you think maybe that's part of the problem, that it's ingrained into certain parts of certain societies in a way that they have no appreciation of the reality of the results of these things, and that the concepts of being a shahid, a martyr, and of holy war, these are very abstract, and it kind of means that you had, as a doctor, as a person who wasn't subscribing to that, a very tangible sense of what it all meant. But these vast swathes of extremist societies really don't. They're bringing people up to carry out atrocities.
So I would say, when you say society, it makes it sound like it's nationwide, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case. But it was a complete revelation to me to discover that people had martyrdom ideology. I even spent fellowship with the Templeton Cambridge Foundation learning about martyrdom ideology, which has almost no underpinnings in Islam, because unlike, let's say, Christians, where there's a very long religious experience of martyrdom, Islam really doesn't have that. And so these concepts had not been anything that I had been reared with or even in conversation with. And so as I understood the radicalization, for instance, of children, I examined in post-Taliban Pakistan near the northwest frontier, where there was a civilian military partnership looking at a school rehabilitating children that had been Taliban operatives, in fact, teenagers. That's where I learned how they'd been seduced into the movement and how they were maintained and indoctrinated, how they were severed from their families. It's also what I learned almost 10 years later in post-ISIS northern Iraq, where I met children that had been kidnapped and turned into ISIS child soldiers and kept captive and radicalized and turned into lethal instruments of this horrific ideology, and how to recover those individuals, as well as the survivors of the Yazidi genocide. So wherever I've looked at this, most recently in this country, in the days after October 7th, I was able to come and look at and take some of the first eyewitness testimony from survivors of Kibbutz Be'eri, eyewitness testimony from the workers in the Shura, that's the morgue, and eventually examine all of the forensic remains that were made accessible to me at Abu Kabir, the Forensic Institute, and actually look at the horrific physical handiwork of this kind of Islamism. There were a couple of moments. I remember in 2018, I had the chance to go into one of the Hamas tunnels that had been uncovered with then Gaza Deputy Division Commander Kobe Vailer. And I asked to see inside the tunnel. The IDF granted the permission. And I remember looking at this very well constructed tunnel, the finished concrete, the electrical wiring, the ventilation. I remember thinking the obsession of the ideology that's resulted in this physical structure. And less than what would be 5 years later, I was looking at human remains and the frenzied injuries and the defilement of the human body, which I've been treating for almost 40 years, at the mercy of this ideology. So fortunately or unfortunately, radical Islam is an ideology that I understand all too well.
Why do you think there have been Muslims around the world who've been so inspired by that ideology? For example, those Nukba forces and even civilians who stormed over the border with the Gaza Strip on October the 7th and carried out those acts. Are they inspired by Quranic verses? Are they inspired by what you call radicalization? What exactly is it that seems to end up in that result all too often?
Such a complex question, but a couple of things that I've noticed is there's a complete lack of contact with true literacy in their faith, in meaning the faith of Islam. I think there's also a complete absence of being able to read Arabic, understand it with translation, and discuss it with nuance. There's a heavy emphasis on indoctrination, and I've seen that in the Swat Valley in northwest part of Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan. I've seen that in the environs of children that were taken to Mosul. And I was able to see that even with the individuals that were prepared to be the Hamas commandos that perpetuated October 7th, the terrorists. So I think lack of critical thinking, lack of access to knowledge about the religion, lack of translation, and then combine that with a sense of victimhood, which is of great concern to me because that has become rampant in the West, and targeting with Islamism its central tenet, a lethal genocidal hatred for the Jewish person, the state of Israel, global Jewry, and it's a very dangerous mix. Some things I'm not able to explain, but I was able to look at literature that was provided to inspire the perpetrators of October 7th. And it's extremely frightening how they might extract a verse from the Quran or an ayat and then have an entire litany as to how that would justify all kinds of violence. It's actually very terrifying to look at it that way, because you can see how individuals can be indoctrinated and motivated and moved en masse towards this, though they also use drugs and stimulants and then inducements and many other factors that went into that kind of terrorism.
One of those things you mentioned is a kind of lack of literacy of Islam and Arabic in general. And I do wonder whether they would say, well, we're actually reading those things correctly. You know, there are Quranic verses which do clearly lend themselves to that form of ideology and action because they're used over and over again in that way. And I completely appreciate how, if you grow up with what you did, which is a completely different interpretation of Islam, that it feels just as horrific to you as it does to me as a non-Muslim. But how do we deal with that fact that again and again, there are really brutal people who are behaving that way? And some of them will say, actually, that's how it was meant originally in the 7th century. This is what it described. It described a sort of form of behavior that maybe they feel they're more in line with. Am I misunderstanding it with that question?
So the question you're asking me, I'm not sure I have a scholar's answer to, but the exact same question was posed to me when I spoke about radical Islam in Iraq. And it was posed to me by Iraqi Muslims who had survived Saddam's efforts at genocide and would quote verses from the Quran to motivate them. And I think I don't have an explanation for why such verses exist. But then if we are taking those verses to exist to justify all of this violence, it disregards the fact that Muslims are required to believe in the Injil, the gospel, to believe in Moses. We began the conversation off camera talking about two Jewish prophets, over 25 prophets, I think, in Judaism that the Muslims have to recognize. And then many examples where the prophet took inspiration from the pattern of the Jewish people. For instance, the reason why Fridays are holy days, he saw people preparing for the Sabbath and wondered what they were readying themselves for, or how he saw Jewish people preparing for the Passover and fasting in thanks for the Exodus. And therefore he said, you are a mortal, I'm a messenger. I will fast as well. And there's an optional fast, which Muslims can do. So I think that when you extract it with one intention, this becomes extremely dangerous. We even see it in the modern day. It's slightly different. It's not only the Quran, but other derived materials. Let's call them certain kinds of Islamic law, which are loosely termed Sharia. You know, the word in the Quran only appears a few times, but Sharia can be in many different schools of thought. And we see what's happening in Pakistan with the weaponization and the institution of blasphemy laws that's leading to the murder of Christians, the murder of Baha'is and minority Muslims. All of this is a very destructive form of extremism, which ultimately undermines the Muslim and Islam itself. And there's a saying that we have, which is, judge not Islam by the Muslim, because we fall so short and to so many extremes of its ideals.